Gradually, people began to understand that modernization theory of development was not the answer to developmental issues. And this came with the realization that decolonization, that is, having independence, does not actually translate directly into self-determination. And one of the reasons was that in these decolonized countries, for example, Pakistan, India, and other countries also, the language that remained as an official language was still the colonial language. People now began at this stage to question the socio-historical processes at work that lead to language choices in terms of language policy, language choices in education and what leads to them. And then, of course, this was all triggered by the failure of modernization theory, as we said earlier. Now, let me remind you about the modernization theory. In modernization theory of development, it was argued that all the third world countries need to follow the example of the Western countries, who were supposed to be the modern countries and the developed countries. And that would mean that everything that was traditional, including the languages of these countries, were deficient in some way. So these had to be abandoned for the economic progress of these nations. However, in the 1970s, we had this economic downturn which brought to the surface the problems related to the modernization theory and this concept of how we were dealing with languages, and this led to the questioning of the whole system itself. That is, how is it that all that is West is seen up to or looked up to as the best? So this was a time that language minorities also began to ask for their language rights. That is, they started to ask that the languages that were used in education for their children should be the home languages. And then there was a lot of work to reclaim the languages that had been partially lost. And we see that even without state help, that there were groups of people who were rallying around their languages. They set up academies, they started work, and they tried to bring the prestige of their languages back. And the focus over here was on an accommodation approach. Now, accommodation approach is posited against the assimilatory approach to language. In accommodation approach, we accept different languages and different cultures, and we see them as legitimate, and we accept them. In an assimilatory approach, the state imposes one language, and we see anything that is not that language or that culture is looked down upon. So people now started to argue for an equal status of their languages. Now, this whole thing was actually driven by the concept of individual and collective agency. That is, the potential to do something by the individuals and by the communities collectively. So it was argued that if we are to enable these individuals or enable these communities to make their pathways for progress, we need to empower them by recognizing their language and by understanding that language difference is only about diversity, and it does not mean a deficit of some kind. So this whole ideology of one language, and that is the best language, and those who do not know that language are somehow deficient or intellectually incapable, this was all challenged.